Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this Raw Umber video. In this 1 hour pose, I'm gonna use a drawing method of not putting any information at all in the shadows, as I find this is a really good drawing exercise. Now I'm using white paper here, and I'll be using willow charcoal in order to draw most of the drawing. I also like to use blending tools, and this can be anything from a tissue, a stump, or a selection of brushes, depending on what you prefer to use. And finally, I like to use a soft compressed charcoal pencil as well. I like to use this for the detail mostly. This General's charcoal pencil in particular is one of my favorites because it's relatively easy to erase, which can be an issue with compressed charcoal pencils. And finally, I like to use a putty rubber. The grey ones are the best, nice and flexible and easy to erase. Now, as always, you can find my materials in the materials box below the video. But of course, feel free to use whatever materials you prefer. So let's get started with the drawing. And for this, I'm using an old piece of willow charcoal. You can see it's completely been flattened, so the grain is nice and open. And I'm just going to cover the whole of my paper with it. And the goal here is to blend this into the paper to create a nice mid-tone. And the darker, the better here. So I might do this a few times, working into the paper and then using a bit of blending tool or tissue or an old rag to work it in. Alright, so once I'm happy with my tone, I want to talk about measuring a little bit. And I'm using a system called comparative measuring here. And what this means is that I'm gonna use a stick or my pencil and lay this across the photo and then compare it and see if I can find another measurement that fits in the same way. So for instance, on the photograph, I can see that her chin to the top of her head is roughly the same as her forehead to the back of her skull. And as you can see, I can use a piece of charcoal or a stick to just compare the length to the width of this square shape. So this is called comparative measurement. I'm constantly comparing relative lengths and widths to other parts of the drawing and other parts of the photograph. And I'm going to be using this the whole video. And it's a really useful system because it can help you compare and measure really easily. Now, if I divide this square shape into 4 equal parts, so I'm dividing in half horizontally and I'm also dividing it in half vertically, we can see that the ear sits in the lower left quarter and the eyes are more or less in the halfway mark. And we can also see that the jawline starts in that vertical midway point. So what I can do here is draw a sphere for the cranium or the skull. And I can use more of a rectangular shape for the jawline going into the front of the face. And this is just a very nice, basic shape that can help you draw the skull. And then of course we can see there's a bit of hair behind that, so I'm just adding this on as well. But just a little placeholder, not too many details at the moment. So now I've got a generic skull shape. I can start adding some measurements that I find that work quite well in most people. And the first measurement I always like to use is the 3/3 of the features. This is the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose, bottom of the nose to brow line, and finally brow line to top of the forehead. Now these don't always work on each person, but they're a nice place to start. For instance, on her, I can see that the bottom of the nose to where the fringe or the starts is roughly equal to the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin, but there's a bit more space for the forehead area. So I'm just dropping these two measurements to make it more like her face. Now I can relate these measurements to other parts of the skull as well. For instance, if I look at the brow line and the bottom of the nose to the middle third, I can see that the ear fits in nicely between the two, just behind that jawline. Now one thing that's important with the ear is that it's actually tilting backwards a little bit. So always make sure to just angle that ear. It's not always or ever straight. So this part of the drawing is called the blocking in, and you can see why it's named this way, because really I'm working in big blocks, looking at big measurements and just trying to build the structure of a portrait. And I often think of building a house, so often with portraits we tend to want to start working on small detail as soon as possible. But if we were building a house, we'd start with the foundation, building the walls, making sure everything is in the right shape, has the right measurements, and then later on start adding the pretty stuff. And the same thing and the same method I can apply to drawing. So I'm first looking for the structure, and I'm looking for the bigger measurements. And then later I can add the detail on top of that drawing. So I've just added in the shoulders here, keeping in mind that the left shoulder is a little bit higher than the right in this pose. And next I can start adding the hair on top of the skull. So just like I was working on the bigger shapes with the structure of the skull, that same method applies to the hair. So I'm just looking for the bigger shapes here, for instance the shape of the fringe and how it overlaps the forehead. The bigger shape of the hair sitting on top of the skull. And I'm not really concerned with individual hairs here, I'm just looking to build up the general measurements and the general shapes. And one thing that can be really helpful with this is cross-referencing your shapes. So for instance, if I look at the bottom of the hair, I can see this is in line with the bottom of the jawline. So I can extend imaginary lines there in order to make sure everything is in the right place. So this is the blocking in phase, and I'm just going to continue working on this, pushing some shapes around without adding more information before we're going to get to the next phase, which is working in shapes rather than lines. Now, while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Alright, so hopefully you'll have a drawing that's pretty generic and pretty general, but you're happy with most of the placements. And next thing I want to talk about is the profile and how it changes the likeness. So for instance, if I change the vertical shape here and make the shape of her jawline come forward, it looks like a different person already. And the same thing if I do it the other way around. So rather than small detail like eyes or lips, the likeness is actually formed by the shape of the skull more than anything else. Now in her case, I can see it's pretty vertical from the start of her eye sockets to the bottom of her chin. And now I'm going to start looking at the shape of her nose. And good questions to ask yourself here are things like, where does the bridge of the nose start coming out? In her case, for instance, it's around the middle of her eyes, about 2/3 up from the bottom of the nose. We can also try and simplify the nose into straight lines in order to make it easier to break down. So like I was saying earlier, I want to switch away from lines and start working in shapes. And what this means is that I'm going to look at the light shape of the nose, try to simplify it into 4 straight lines, 1 for the top, 1 for the bottom, and 2 for the sides, and try and replicate this shape by darkening the area surrounding it. And these darker shapes surrounding the shape of the light of the nose also have their own angles and measurements. So for instance, looking at the bridge of the nose, we can see a dark shape extending into the forehead, so a sort of triangular shape there. Now, of course, there's lots of detail in there. We can see the eyes are in there. We can also see the difference between the hair and the skin. But for the purpose of this exercise, I'm just going to completely flatten this, have no detail at all, and just make this all a single dark shape. And this may seem counterintuitive, and it may also feel a bit wrong not putting the information you see in there, but this forces us to make decisions in terms of what information is important and what isn't. Now, if you're not completely comfortable with the idea of just erasing everything, feel free to leave a few lines untouched. But if you really want to go all the way, feel free to just completely blacken out these shadows. And the idea behind this exercise is that we don't actually need that much information in order to understand that this is a portrait. For instance, when I start drawing the mouth, all I need to do is first look for that blocking in. So doing a bit of measuring. In this case, I can divide the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into 3 equal thirds, with the first mark being the top lip and the second mark being the start of the chin. And I'm just gonna look at dark shapes here, just filling these in, trying to think of them as abstract triangles and squares. And I'm paying extra attention to the outline here, the way we can see the triangles of the lips overlapping the background. Trying to constantly measure as well what lines up vertically, what lines up horizontally, which bits stick out the most, which bits stick out a little bit less far. And as I do this, the lips just almost magically start to form. If you find that the outline is starting to get a bit messy, feel free to use an outline here to clear some stuff up. I try to stay away from the rubber at this point of the drawing because I want to later use this in order to pull the highlights out. Alternatively, you can use a brush to clean up a bit of the outline, but it really depends on your preference here. But the main goal is still to just have these really clean, dark and light shapes. And I'm just going to continue drawing the shapes in the neck, the bottom of the chin, the triangular shape below the chin, and the big dark shape of the hair. And of course, while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Now the really nice thing about working this way, in my opinion, is that it simplifies the drawing so much. Instead of trying to draw a portrait, we're just drawing little puzzle shapes of squares and triangles. And instead of having to draw all these different tones or values, we're only having to choose between dark or light shape. And so this makes the whole drawing and the whole portrait so much easier to grasp and draw. And it gives a nice solid base to then put details on top of. Now try to make sure that your drawing is nice and dark and that your shadows are all roughly the same tone or value before we start getting into the next phase of the drawing. And this next phase of the drawing is all about gradations. So instead of adding information inside of the shadow, I'm just going to look at how it gradates into the lights. And at this point I start using my compressed charcoal, still with a fairly light touch. But the nice thing about compressed charcoal is that it doesn't erase quite as easily, which can be a handicap if you make a mistake, or something really nice when you want to blend on top of these shapes. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at the edges of my dark shapes, and I'm going to try and find one hard edge per element of the drawing. So for instance, looking at the nose here, I can see a very clear, dark, sharp edge near the outside of the nostril, in between the cheek and the side of the nostril there. Now in order to make this hard edge seem even sharper, I'm going to take my stump or another blending tool and just gently go over the edges or the boundaries between my light and my dark shapes. And what this does is soften them up, give them a bit of a blur, which makes my hard edges stand out even more. And I can then go over these same shapes again with my compressed charcoal to make sure I keep the shape. So there's going to be a bit of back and forth here. I'm first outlining all of my shapes with my compressed charcoal, and then I'm going to start blending and gradating shapes into each other, trusting that the compressed charcoal will not let me lose my shapes completely. So gradating these dark shapes into the light shapes creates a nice soft feel, which helps make the form or the nose feel like it's turning around slowly. So there's a sort of gradation to the darks. Now the light shape itself also has a gradation, and again we can see it's lightest near that sharp edge of the nostril and then gets darker towards the tip of the nose. So that's the next bit I'm going to start putting in using my putty rubber. And again, I'm not focusing at all on small things like a little bit of half tone on the side of the nostril or little shapes. I'm just looking at the big gradation of the light shape. I'm going to try and make this as soft as possible, going all the way from almost white of the paper to the shadow near the tip of the nose. Now, as you use your blending tools, you may lose some of that white again, so you may have to do this a few times, adding in the white using the rubber, then blending it in to create a nice gradation, and then going back in and reinstating that nice bit of white of the paper where you see the lightest bit of the light shape. And this also goes for the shadows. If you notice that by blending this, the shadows start getting a bit lighter. It's a good idea to reinstate the shadows and make it nice and dark again. Because ultimately, we always want to keep that structure of light shapes versus dark shapes really nice and clear. So I'm just using a bit of willow here to just re-darken some of my shadows, to make it nice and clear what is the darks and what is part of the lights. So while looking at these gradations, in both the lights and the darks, I try to emphasize the really strong lines as much as I can to the harder edges, the edges that are really nice and crisp. And I try to overstate the softness of the other edges in order to make the contrast between the two even stronger. So if I see a little bit of a hard edge, I'm going to make it really nice and crisp. And if I see a bit of a soft edge, I'm going to really get a nice gradation going there. And these effects get even more pronounced if you put them next to each other. So for instance, looking at the shape, that sharp shape next to the nostril, we can see on the other side of that shadow, it's really rather soft. And so I can make this even softer using my blending brush, making a really nice big gradation. And by doing this, by over softening some of these shadow shapes or edges, I make the sharp edges stand out even more. And so you can see that the nose now feels a lot more finished than the rest of the drawing, and all I've done is add sharp and soft edges and gradations. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing for the mouth, looking at the sharp versus the soft edges. So I've just outlined my shadow shapes using my compressed charcoal to make sure that I don't lose them. And now I'm going in with my putty rubber and I'm going to find the gradation in the light shape. And in this case I can see the light is lightest near the lip and gets darker and gradates away as it goes towards the nose and the nostrils. When looking for sharps, I tend to see them more when there's an overlap. So in this case we can see her face is overlapping the background, superimposed on the background, and so we can see really nice shapes there. And so what I'm doing here is I am going around these shapes using my compressed charcoal, using light pressure, and just outline them and make them nice and crisp. Then again, just like I did on the nose, I'm just adding some more charcoal to join all of my dark shapes together, making sure there's no information in them. And then I'm gonna go around, looking at the edges of these dark shapes, looking at the difference between the softness near the cheek and the crisp outline near the background. And I'm gonna try and add these gradations in and try to overdo them, really soften the side that's soft and really crisp up the sides that feel more sharp. And as I do this, as I soften more and more, you can see that the lips are starting to feel more and more realistic. And I'm really not doing that much. I'm not adding a lot of extra information. I'm just looking at the edges of my shapes. And I really like this way of working because it's a very similar way of working as if you'd be painting in oil paint, for instance, or watercolor. It's ultimately just big stains of color, and all we can do is control how quickly one color blends into the other. So I'm just going to do the same thing for the chin here, outlining my dark shapes and then blending the soft edges and crisping up the edges that feel sharper, and always trying to look for the two extremes. Have at least one edge really sharp and another edge really soft. Now I've been working on the smaller shapes first because I find these are the easier shapes to see. But we can also apply this method of working to larger shapes. For instance, looking at her cheek. If I just mentally erase the hair falling over her cheek, I can see that her cheek is lightest near the ear and gets darker as it goes towards the shadows. And this makes sense because of course the light is slowly falling away until the planes of the face turn into shadow. And once again I can do the same thing here. I can just start figuring out a big gradation. Now I can either blend this gradation in using my blending tool, or I can use some line, letting the line slowly fade into the mid of the paper, and I'm using my rubber for this. Alright, and then the final bit is of course the eye and the eye socket. And I've left this for last because it's the most tempting to put information in. And I'm really going to try hard not to put any information in there. No eye socket. I'm just looking at the borders of the shapes. And I'm going to join all of my darks together into one single tone. And of course, while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Alright, so I've really joined up the hair with the rest of the shadow. And again, this can be very counterintuitive, but it can also create a very strong drawing. So it's just good to try out this method just as an exercise. Now for the hair itself, I'm going to use exactly the same method of figuring out the big gradations of light, mid-tone and shade. But because the hair is mostly dark, I'm first going to darken all of this, and then I'm going to actually use my rubber to carve out the light shape, making as random a movement as possible, because of course hair is not very symmetrical. And once I've got this big light shape in, again I can go in there with my blending tool and just look at the gradations, the softness of the hair, and try and look at how quickly that highlight dissolves into the general tone of the hair. And once you get into the hang of working like this, rather than drawing out each individual hair, it can be really freeing and fun. Because as long as we get the shapes in roughly the same place or the right place, it doesn't really matter if it's a little bit off or a little bit random. So for the back of the hair, I'm now doing the same thing, first just covering it with my charcoal. Then blending this in and using random movements of my rubber to create the highlights. And then finally blending this in some areas using my blending tool. Now when looking at the highlight here, note that I've used 3 large shapes rather than lots of small shapes, and this helps create a sense of unity for the hair rather than lots of small little marks that can bring a bit too much focus to that part of the drawing. Because ultimately what we want is for the viewer to look at the face, not at the hair. And this also goes for a place like the neck. Instead of adding too much detail and small shapes, I'm just adding in a big gradation for the light and leaving it at that. And again, because I want most of the detail to be in the areas where I want the viewer to look, which in this case would be the features of the face. Of course, feel free to decide where you want the viewer to look and add some more detail in those parts of the drawing, and then leave some detail out in places where you don't really necessarily want the viewer to look. And this method of working, figuring out where you want to put your detail and where you want to leave it out, is called focal point. And this is something that the Impressionists sort of more or less discovered. Because as the camera was invented, they understood that all we really see is patches of light or dark or color on our eyeball, and that's how we interpret the world. And when we look at an object, we really can only focus on one small part at a time. If I hold my hand close to my face, I can only see that as a sharp object and not the background behind it. And so working this way, focusing the detail where you want it and blurring out bits that you feel are not as important, is an important part of bringing out that focal point and actually making the drawing feel more realistic because of that, because it imitates what our eye naturally does. So I'm just going to add a few more details and small adjustments in my focal point. And again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments. Now up until this point I've ignored the hair overhanging her cheeks because I was looking at the big gradations. And now I've got this bigger soft gradation in. It's a fairly easy job to just add a few hints at hair and then blend these in to make sure that they connect with the rest of the hair there. And again, you can be fairly free with drawing things like the hair, because it doesn't really matter if it's a little bit moved or a little bit different, because of course hair is very flexible and very movable and very soft. So I try to emphasize the softness of the hair rather than each individual hair, even when adding small detail, like the hair falling over her cheek. So as we're nearing the end of the pose, I'm going to spend the rest of my time trying to figure out my focal point, adding small detail in there, trying to keep my shadows nice and flat without any detail inside of that, just for the sake of this exercise. And I'm also going to continue to soften the areas that I feel are not in the focal point. So while I'm doing this again, feel free to ask me anything you like in the comments, or if you're already done, feel free to photograph your work and post it here in the chat. And otherwise, I will speak to you at the end of the pose. Alright, so that's the end of the post for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you feel like you've learned something about how to draw a picture just by using the edges of light and dark shapes. Now, like I said earlier, if you'd like to post your work, feel free to do so here in the chat using the photograph button, or otherwise, if you prefer Instagram, use the hashtag #RawUmberLive. Finally, if you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to join us each week, we do one figure drawing video each Wednesday, one portrait drawing each Sunday, and in addition to that, we do lots of special videos focusing on oil painting and other things. So feel free to consider subscribing if that's something you'd be interested in.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.